A couple of years ago, there was something that always bothered me. And that was the sort of pervasive idea that pixel art was easier than HD graphics. Personally, I've always pretty much disagreed with this position. I've always found that hand-drawn art is easier to do than pixel art. So 2 years ago, I made a video about it. And well, this video along with another one I made opened up a big can of worms. A lot of people came out and either said they really dislike pixel art, or were mad at me for bashing on pixel art. What I regret nowadays with that video was that I was so preoccupied with giving reasons for why hand-drawn is easier than pixel art that I kinda gave the impression that they're vastly different skills. And I don't think they are. And even though I think it's reasonable to have a discussion on which is easiest, I think it's important to note that they're both roughly equally difficult and they're both roughly the same skill. I kind of think that pixel art and HD graphics share more similarities than they do differences. And I think it's kind of weird to actively hate pixel art. I'm not team HD graphics, I like pixel art. And I don't think just because you want to make a game in HD that you should ignore all the resources that relate to pixel art, even if you do dislike pixel art. What I think is important to understand is that pixel art is a visual art medium. It's not a style. Now, what is a visual art medium? Well, in the broader sense, medium kind of describes the materials we use. Oil paint is a different medium from acrylic paint, which is a different medium from watercolor. And all of these mediums are different from the digital medium, from digital art. But digital art overall is not just one medium. Pixel art is still using a pen, but it's considerably different from hand-drawn art, which is considerably different from 3D art. Now, my game art looks like this, but if we look at my digital paintings, well, they look like this. This is how I paint digitally, and if we look closer, we can see I paint digitally quite similar to how my game art looks. If I do a traditional piece with watercolor and inking, this is similar to how I draw a bush in game art. These look like different styles, but I'm drawing pretty much the same, just using different mediums. And this doesn't just go for traditional art into game art. There's a big overlap there, but the same overlap exists between hand-drawn game art and pixel game art. Here's my style in hand-drawn art versus my style in pixel art. It's the same style, with one tweak to the style. And the reason I say this is that I can spend 5,000 hours learning digital art and then spend 20 hours learning watercolor, and after 20 hours I could paint this. The principle remains, you're practicing very similar art fundamentals, so the skills are very transferable. You can still have a discussion between which is easier, but the fact remains that if you practice one, you're also kind of practicing the other. Now, there are differences between different medium, and they do give different results and vibes. But as I said, by and large, you can actually kind of directly translate my HD art to pixel art and have passable results. I might not do the jaggies or the doubles quite the same, because I haven't practiced pixel art, but it still looks decent. There are more similarities between my art in HD and my art in pixel art compared to a game like Tales of Iron. These have different medium, but same style. These might have same medium, but they have different style. The difference here is actually bigger. Basically, pixel art and HD game art are kind of the same. So if you want to learn HD game art, even if you dislike pixel art, you should analyze pixel art. If you feel that there are too few channels that are dedicated to HD graphics, just look at some of the many pixel art channels out there. We essentially say the same things. Different medium, same art fundamentals. And the opposite is true. If you want to learn pixel art, you should look at HD game art. I obviously personally prefer HD 2D graphics. I prefer that medium. But I really love seeing games like Eastward, Cult of the Lamb, Fields of Mystria, or Enter the Gungeon. They have really cool art that I like, and I can learn from that art. Now you might be saying, but Cult of the Lamb is not 2D. Once again, forest for the trees. There's still a visual overlap between whatever 3D game you might look at and a 2D game. Technically speaking, Eastward and Enter the Gungeon aren't 2D either, but none of that matters. I can learn from them all the same. As I said, you can learn sculpting from drawing, so you can learn 2D from 3D. A lot of the skills are transferable. Let's look at Fields of Mystria. There are a lot of really cool art here. Now this is pixel art, but suppose I copy this asset pretty much exactly, but I make it in higher resolution. So I take something like this and I just trace over it. Now I have this, a high resolution but rather blocky asset. Now if I just copy like this, maybe it looks a bit flat, but with just a bit more details, you kind of have something that kind of works in HD. Now I'm not saying that you should start copying pixel art assets. I'm not even saying that this is necessarily an ideal asset for HD art. What I am saying is that quite often I find it beneficial to look at pixel art when figuring out how to solve things in HD. An asset like this is kind of HD. It borrows a lot of the principles that you might see in Pokemon. The inherent constraint in pixel art, where you have to make simple shapes and simple designs that read well, is often something that is a good starting point when making any asset. I like to imagine that I kind of draw my art in around a 320 by 180 resolution. My art should be so simple that it reads well at a low bit resolution, which is why I should be able to transfer this scene to low bit pixel art. And in that sense, my visual style often has way more in common with fairly low bit pixel games like Celeste compared to games like Ghost Song. And the truth is that there's just a lot of good pixel art out there. And I do think it would be sad to just ignore all that good art just because you don't like how blocky it looks. Some of you might argue that there are a lot of pixel art techniques that aren't similar to hand-drawn art. There are obviously a lot of techniques that are kind of particular to pixel art. How to deal with jaggies, doubles, anti-aliasing and dithering, and while the list continues. I don't think that list is that long compared to all the commonalities. You know what I talk about in my videos? Starting small by thumbnailing, focusing on making the main shapes readable, restricting your palette, and focusing on getting your values correct. You know what pixel artists recommend doing? Well, pretty much the same thing. Same art fundamentals, different medium. You might be a pixel artist, but by and large, you are just a visual artist. We are 95% the same. I'm not an oil artist, I'm not a watercolor artist, but I do stuff in those mediums. Now you might be thinking that at the end of the day, this distinction doesn't matter. But I think it does. If you want to be a good artist, it's good to take any opportunity you get as an opportunity to learn. And even though I don't actually draw that often in pixel art, I do like to steal processes from pixel art. You know that specific to pixel art technique I mentioned earlier, dithering? Guess what? I've realized I kinda like dithering in HD. Now dithering used to be particularly common in older games where they had a limited color palette. And they used dithering to create gradients. By alternating black and white pixels, you would get something that at a distance kind of looks gray. Now you can create smooth gradients in pixel art, but people still often don't. Instead, they still use dithering. The idea of learning pixel art is about adopting the principle of placing every single pixel with intention. You draw with pixels. And I actually personally like this idea and follow a similar principle. I don't like the idea of building my pieces slowly with low opacity. I tend to be quite bold, but rather than pixels, they're kind of dot or splotches. I actually think dithering with splotches look kind of nice. And I've started doing it when I draw tiles. When I draw tiles, I add a grid and only make transitions on each grid line, exactly as you would with a pixel. So I make a transition on this grid line and this grid line, and the transition is just a solid color. And now with the few transitions points I have, I add splotches of paint to dither the transition. This is a pixel art trick that I've transitioned into hand-drawn medium, and I've done it because I study pixel art. If we take that technique but transition it to hand-drawn art, it doesn't look square and boxy. It looks different, but it still looks interesting. If the principle works in pixel art, then it will probably work in hand-drawn art. Now when I say all of this, you might be confused. Why do I on the one hand say that hand-drawn art is easier than pixel art, and then in the next breath say that they're kind of the same? Well, I recommend you watch my video comparing the two mediums, but basically, there are constraints that come with pixel art that are tricky to deal with, that are inherent to pixel art. And you can technically avoid these constraints with HD graphics. And we can get into the discussion of this in the comments. But the point I end on in that video is basically that I don't think it's extremely clear cut which is easier. For some, pixel art will be easier, and for others, HD will be easier. And I think you ought to pick the medium you like the most. For me, HD graphics is significantly easier and quicker to do. And that might be the case for you too. But what I feel like I missed discussing in that video is that whichever medium you pick, you will actually get good at the other medium. And I just kind of want to put it out there that a pixel art tutorial is often a good resource for learning hand-drawn art, because by and large, pixel art and hand-drawn art are the same skill. Thanks for watching. Bye.